Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Something I've come to believe more and more in recent years is that folks in the humanities and social sciences have really come to abuse the word critical. So much so that it has at best become meaningless, and at worst, it has actually come to mean the opposite of what it originally meant. And to go even further, I believe that this abuse of the word critical, poor critical, I mean, you really have to feel for it. I think the way we've come to misuse this word actively impedes learning. Because the modern roots of this term go back to thinkers like Immanuel Kant, who argued for a critical philosophy in which we would reflexively investigate reason with the goal of uncovering its limitations. Later, the idea was taken up by the so-called Frankfurt School, especially Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, who put forward a vision of critical theory which involved rigorously examining the ideas and assumptions that are taken as common sense in a society, simply the way things are, and showing that things could be otherwise, that our common sense ideas are contingent human creations masquerading as something like natural laws. In this way, the critical tradition calls for relentless and self-reflexive investigation and questioning. But this is not what's going on with so much academic thinking today that calls itself critical. Not at all. A lot of stuff that calls itself critical is the expression of a thoroughly standardized way of thinking, which often reduce things to a hackneyed vision of corporations versus the people. That in the United States, this vision goes at least back to the progressive era. This so-called critical thinking is cliché unthinking. It's really not a form of critical reflection at all, but rather platitudinous opining, where the verdict is known before the argument even gets made. It's a form of ideological off-gassing. You especially see this with communication that fits the form of what scholars call the techlash, the social fad where it became popular to express negative opinions about digital technology firms. I mean, you can make a lot of money if you become a successful techlasher. Poor critical. Poor critical. This way of doing things is getting in the way of understanding. You especially see this with AI today. Now, I am on the record with the bet that currently hyped AI systems, especially generative AI, will have only modest impacts on the economy and job markets in the next few years. I mean, really, folks, are we interested in investigating and learning about the world around us? Or are we more interested in sniffing the foul products of our painfully dyspeptic digestive systems? Too many self-identified critics, with that word in quotation marks here, have gotten into the hobby of Dutch ovening themselves. Wake up, go outside, and look at what other people who are not yourself are doing. That's one thing I really love about today's guest, my old friend Aure Schrock, an interdisciplinary technology scholar and writing coach and editor at the Indelible Voice. Aure wrote their book, Politics Recoded, the Infrastructural Organizing of Code for America, on a topic that causes lots of knee-jerk dismissive opining in many technology studies, namely civic tech, or the idea of using digital technologies to improve government operations and services. But you see, one thing I really love about Aure is that they aren't cynical. Aure is genuinely interested in and curious about what other people think, how they hope, and what they do. So he investigated the organization Code for America in a much deeper way than superficial critics of it ever have. One way Aure puts this in the interview here is that they identify as an interpretive rather than a critical scholar. And this is one good way to put things. Even though I think that actually Aure's criticisms of Code for America are that much deeper and more insightful for all the interpretive work they did. But by raising the idea of interpretation in this way, Aure is pointing to a much older tradition of thinking in the humanities and social sciences, what's sometimes called hermeneutics, or the German term Verstehen, which is often translated understanding. And for interpretation to work in some specific ways, well, you have to fucking get over yourself and what you think. And in key ways, you have to become interested in other people. Aure's generous and curious approach to investigation provides so many benefits. And we're all the richer for the insights contained in their book, Politics Recoded. In this interview, we chat about how the book came to be, how Aure came to understand the history and sociology of Code for America, and we also chat about the coaching and editing work that Aure does in their company, The Indelible Voice, which you should check out. I so enjoy Aure's company and learn so much from them, which is why I can say in all sincerity, hey, get excited! Aure, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Yeah, and I am excited.
Beautiful.
Sorry, I've been sitting on that one for a while.
Oh man, I know. I just before we got in this call, my team had a heart to heart to me with me about how I had been getting too excited recently and getting too loud. So anyway, thank you for that, Aure. It warms my heart to hear you say that. Uh, Politics Recoded is a cool book. When you're talking about it with strangers, what do you say it's about? What were you trying to do with it?
I mean, I think to understand what I'm trying to do with it, you have to go back in time, like to the late aughts, back to networked politics when that was dominant. 2009 when Code for America was formed was right after, Obama was elected, and there was a lot of enthusiasm about the power of networks. And so it's really about, I think, the transformation of kind of political action from network politics to what I call infrastructural politics. And infrastructural politics really situates the individual as a kind of agentic administrator, capable of, tinkering not just with digital infrastructure, but the ways that digital infrastructure connects and, regulates people's lives. Typically, this is really the provenance of government. And so, kind of one of the central tensions that pervades the book is between benevolent administrators and publics. There are a lot of kind of juicy classic debates in it as well. And it's also an organizational history of a really influential nonprofit. I think a lot of things came out of Code for America. I think it really normalized the idea of user-centered design, even speeding up to a federal level. So there's kind of an institutional angle. And it really kind of legitimated this idea that people could get involved with the kinds of projects that typically were the provenance of government. So yeah, I'll stop there, but that's sort of like the quick pitch. It's kind of a story of an organization, but also a story of the evolution of how we think about political action.
Yeah. There's so many interesting values and conversations, political conversations, technological conversations of the moment really gelled in that organization. So I think it really allows you to kind of read out a lot of things. How'd you come to write this thing? I mean, how'd you get into it?
Well, I mean, the short version is it was a very long trajectory. I didn't realize I was writing a book for a very long time. Um, I can start with sort of the kind of theoretical cornerstones. It's a long story, but it came out of me going through my PhD program. This isn't my dissertation, just to be clear,
Yeah.
which is a whole nother story that we don't have time for. Um, this really came out of, I think, a lot of interest in civic engagement through working with Henry Jenkins and his Civic Paths group, and Balsamo. That's where you get sort of the techno-feminist angle and kind of the performance of technology. And then also kind of the organization is kind of the package for the whole discussion, you know? And I think that gives it a little bit more tangibility, to me than, I think if I were to just write kind of too broadly, because, it took a whole book for me to wrap my head around what the heck Code for America is and does. Um, and, I really attribute that to, a professor named Patty Riley, who introduced me to the CCO, or Communication Constitutes Organizing perspective. And that's sort of like what how I think about organizing. And so it's not really a top-down thing necessarily. It's, really about how different people in an organization wield communication to, do things like, situate, or organize shared projects or legitimate themselves to collaborators. So yeah, that's sort of where it came from theoretically and sort of philosophically. I would say empirically, I just started hanging out with a lot of, to be entirely honest, I'm a bit of, uh, I'm easily distracted. So I tend to get involved in a lot of different research projects, particularly as a PhD student. Remember, I said this wasn't my dissertation,
Right.
probably should have been. Little warning there for PhD students trying to spread themselves too thin.
Yeah.
But I just started hanging out with a lot of Code for America folks, maybe starting in 2012 or so, 2013. And,
Yeah.
so I kind of made contacts with folks. I got to be friends with some of them. This is the era of like open data
Yeah.
and civic hackathons. That's really chapter 3, which honestly I don't think is the most interesting chapter, so far as new stuff. But I kind of started there, and that gave me access to that organization. And one of the nice things about Code for America is they are very egalitarian in sort of how they operate. And so there was always a mothership kind of, an office in San Francisco, but, I could visit there, and I have visited there. And I thought at one point that, like, I'd written everything I wanted to about this organization around, like, 2013, 2014, just because they seemed extremely technocratic, to be honest, and I was like, "Oh, okay, I get what they're going for." Um, but then around 2015, like, kind of everything changed. Um, there was a lot of kind of evolution in how the organization operated, and so it just became a more interesting story, and that's a good lesson, right? Like, why do you write a
Yeah.
book? Because the argument you wanna make is book length.
Yeah. Right. Good.
As an editor, I see a
Yeah.
lot of manuscripts that are trying to do too much with thin evidence or not an interesting story, right? It just doesn't have, like, the bones of a book, right? And this just it became apparent that this had the bones of a book. And so it wasn't so much like a strategic project as just something that I fell into and then just kept coming back to. Really over 15 years, before, the manuscript was finalized.
I struggled to language this question I'm going to throw at you, even while I was writing the question. But there's something about your approach to this kind of civic tech space that's different than a lot of the approaches I've seen in kind of STS spaces. And I think part of it is that, like, you are non-cynical. I mean, you're certainly critical. There's all kinds of criticism of Code for America in the book, and you're very explicit about that even in the introduction. That's part of your goals. But it's like you don't have this kind of like knee-jerk kind of like dismissiveness about the civic tech idea that I think a lot of folks in STS immediately had. And it's not like I felt like the word earnest to describe you is too strong. I was thinking earlier about like that there was this like in the early aughts there was like this new sincerity movement in music and all kinds of shit. Anyway, I wanted to kind of bring that out and have you talk about that because I think so often in STS circles is like the move with civic tech was just to like immediately dismiss it as bullshit or whatever, you know? And but the problem with that is I think it didn't
if that's the approach you have right away, it kind of shut down empiricism too, because people weren't curious about it. You know what I mean? So yeah, talk about just like how you relate to it and thought about.
Yeah. And I'm glad you picked up on that, and that's something I struggled with. In some days I wake up and I feel like I'm still um sort of wrapped up in a lot of those debates. But you have to sort of, draw the line somewhere. I would say I really identify as an interpretive researcher more than a critical researcher. And so I'm really interested in understanding the life world of
Nice.
an organization and like people's motivations,
Yeah.
and I don't think I'm willing to just dismiss a lot of their desires as bullshit, like
Yeah.
I don't wanna, like, walk into the room like that, and I don't want to, at the end of the day, present that back to them, and I've shared this book in full with, quite a few people now, in the Code for America sphere, and, I would say they had some quibbles, but, for the most part, they were like, "Yeah, you got it right," and that to me is really important, like, empirically.
Yes.
From a scholarly perspective, I think, STS really is about the politics of technology to me, and I think there's a lot of validity in that. But I do think, um, from an organizational standpoint, you really get a much, it's just more interesting, right? Like, I don't walk into these meeting spaces being like, look at these dupes, like,
Yeah.
slaving away, just because I don't think that's what's happening. And really, I got a lot. I've gotten pushback on this, and I probably will get more. Um, but it's like, do you hold them accountable, or do you, like, what is your role here? And I think it's really, at one point, um, someone in the organization came up to me at a, there are a bunch of sort of yearly events, and they were like, "Oh, hey, it's you are, yeah, you're the institutional memory of the organization." And I was
Yeah.
like,
Amazing.
I mean, on one hand, amazing. On the other hand, I'm like, "Oh, crap." Like,
Yeah.
that's that's a lot of responsibility.
Yeah.
But I do think I'm aware of, dynamics of race, class, gender,
Sure.
and really a lot of the cornerstones of STS. But when I go into those spaces empirically, um, I sort of want to find my feet first, and figure out what the heck is going on, because I don't want to write the same book that other people have written. Like, it used to be, the tale I usually tell is like, when I first started the PhD program at USC Annenberg in 2009, like, there really weren't that many critical books on technology, particularly coming from, folks,
Uh-huh.
and,
Right.
and
The
now you
techlash had not come yet. And we're going to talk more about that later.
Yeah, and now you have, oh my god, just so many, and it's like, what is it that this book is doing that other books don't? What's the promise of this book is how I usually refer to it as an editor. Like, yeah, what does this book do that other books don't? And I wanted to do something different, and I think to do something different, you just need to set up the pieces a little bit differently, and not sort of walk in there with a lot of assumptions, but still be kind of wary of kind of power dynamics and not be naive about it.
Sure. Yeah. That's really nice. And I like your point about being an interpretive scholar. I mean, I taught the methods course in my department, the grad methods course for I think 3 years in a row. And I mean, where I ended up like this past like last spring when I taught it, it's like I was just real clear. I was like, if you hate actors so much that you cannot do the kind of sympathetic work of reconstructing how they view the world in a kind of honest and fair way, if you hate them that much, it's probably not the right project for you. You know what I mean? Like, because you want to. I mean, that's kind of like to the interpretive hermeneutical Verstehen thing is actually doing the work of of reconstructing how people see the world, and you can still be critical, of course, and you can talk about the gaps between their understanding and reality or whatever, but you still have to like be willing to do that work. And sometimes we're so, we have so much anger towards people, we're not capable of that. But, yeah.
I mean, one of the other kind of things that I think I bring to the table is that, and I sort of started to go down this road by mentioning the politics of technology, but a lot of scholarship is not good at looking at both the politics of technology and like politics, like the US political system. And so you have a few people like Dave Karp and others, Daniel Kreis, who really treat technology, really interrogate that intersection through organizing and through organizations. But like there's a lot of people I talk to who are just like, yeah, this is a labor issue. And I'm like, like maybe we're talking to different people, but a lot of, and if when you read the book, like that's why I tell a lot of the stories of the people who came to Code for America, because a lot of them came through like party organizing, or like the meetup scene was very influential because that laid the groundwork for what became the brigades. Like there's a lot, and also just local politics.
Right.
Like calm researchers and a lot of other researchers will not touch local politics as an
Yes.
interesting topic. It's too small potatoes, or
Yeah.
or it's too boring,
Right.
or like they are interested in community activism and local politicians are like just standing in the way of
Right.
community activists. And I get those positions, but for me, like going into city hall, like local politics, the small potatoes thing was actually really great because like, nobody was there. It wasn't like when you go to like if you go to like a Stop LAPD spying meeting,
Yeah.
now it's like half ethnographers. You know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah.
like and like
Right.
just nobody was reaching Code for
Yeah.
America. And I just thought it was really an important organization, even if it, did all these things that people didn't like, sort of
Mhm.
neoliberal. It was very US centric. It emerged from the tech industry, like all these things that people hate.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So
Yeah.
that's like another big
Oh,
thing I
that's
bring to
great,
the
man.
table.
And can you tell the folks a little bit about the kinds of research you did? I mean, you've already started talking. You were hanging out with these folks, and yeah, I mean, yeah,
I would say like how I did my research. Yeah, I mean, I would say I loosely bound it as ethnography. I would
hmm
say I'm not someone who like is interested in the debates about who's doing the purest ethnography. Like I just don't care. I
yeah,
would say ethnography was a way for me to understand like who was doing what. So I knew who to interview. So I knew kind of who was in charge of, different projects. But I think in the book I describe it as something like omnivorous methodology of some type. Just because like, sometimes I would like come out of the field and I'd be like, oh crap, I really need to do a bunch of FOIA requests to get the contracts that Code for America, got with local government or state government. Like I needed to do that stuff. Sometimes I, looked at online media, but to be honest, one of the big challenges was like Code for America is not of how to put this. They're not very good at online media. And I mean that in a loving way. Like they put a ton of stuff up, like, and they never take anything down, by the way, which is awesome. I mean, because I could have like a complete record of everything the organization has done so far as like what they felt, like they should put up online. But like that's not how they generally mobilize people because their goal isn't to mobilize. It's not like Black Lives Matter or something, right? It's not
yeah,
like a social justice oriented movement where they're trying to, critique power and they just need as many, to use online networks to mobilize people. Like that's not what Code for America does. And so a lot of the methodologies, frankly, that folks at in like the Civic Paths group, that was Henry Jenkins' group, which is still going as far as I know. A lot of the methods that they used really weren't applicable because they were doing things like, oh, there's a debate and I'm going to collect tweets with people discussing, the presidential debate. And I mean, I'm like on those papers too, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just like doing that stuff didn't get me closer to answering the questions I wanted
Yeah.
answered,
Yeah.
which was like, how are they, mobilizing people and how are they, changing this model of political action. And so what ended up coming out was like this sort of weird hybrid, but it just I needed to gather a lot of different types of data.
Yeah.
Essentially, not all of it was online.
Yeah. You don't know this because I haven't sent you questions, but you keep perfectly setting up the next thing. So thank you very much for doing that.
Awesome.
And that is, I wanted to just talk about the infrastructural organizing concept a little bit before we kind of jump into the meat and potatoes of the book. So tell us a bit about this concept, infrastructural organizing, and how you see it, and why you think it's apt for Code for America.
Sure, I'd love to. And that's kind of the master concept of the book, right? That's what I'm developing throughout the book. There's also scale, but scale came much later, and that was sort of like I put into the conclusion. And by the way, I'm not a scholar of scale. So if you are a scholar of scale, you can probably tear apart my conclusion if you're so inclined. Have fun. Maybe you can write it better. But so far as infrastructural organizing, I think there's sort of two components to it. One is simply that it is kind of collective action deployed onto infrastructure, right? So infrastructure in sort of the Lee Starr, Jeff Bowker kind of mode of thinking. I approach it more in an interpretive way, right? So how things are connected. Simply put, it's so there's that aspect to it, right? It's just like the object of a lot of the political and collective work that people do in Code for America. But then over time, I think what you saw was a lot of the people in this sphere organizing infrastructurally. And so, and by that, I mean, like, if you think about, I don't know, like an org chart for an organization, right? You have like managers, at the top, and then like workers, and that's like one way of imagining like organizing. Another is like networks, right? Like who's connected to who. I think infrastructural organizing really takes individuals, in particular local settings, with all of like the tools and ideas at their disposal, and really turns them loose on kind of connecting with other people, working on projects. Like prototypes end up being really important in infrastructural organizing. It's really just giving a name to something you see all over the place now with
Yeah.
stuff like public interest technology,
Mm-hmm.
or we could go on, but there's a lot of ways that is now a common way of thinking about what people do. And again, communication is still in the picture, right? Like communication makes this stuff happen. But the way that people actually operate and collaborate is really less hierarchical. It's not top down, and neither is it really just the result of like the sum of networks, right? So it's not necessarily like, although networks figure very prominently in like undergird infrastructural organizing, it can't just be diluted to like, oh, it's just about networks. So it's something new. Yeah, so that's sort of it in a nutshell. But it's really a term that I developed to describe how people collaborate with each other in a way that, and this is how that, how Code for America, in my opinion, can like transcend these borders of like government and community groups, or like uh, publics and administrators, or activists and non-activists. Like I've been in rooms. I was presenting with someone named Remy Kim, and this is in the book too. And I remember at one point I was like, it was all Code for America people in the room, and we were presenting on something. It was like you'll like this. It was like technology is not neutral. Like it's sort of like like one of those sort of like SGS 101 things.
Yeah.
And I remember asking people in the room. I was like, hey, can you raise your hand if you think about yourselves as an activist? And like half the hands went up. And I'm like, that's really interesting. And I think that's what infrastructural organizing does, because infrastructure is, like that famous Lee Star quote goes, like, isn't it something like, everybody's problem, but no one's responsibility? Like you can tinker with infrastructure in ways that go outside of things like policies, laws, regulations. That can actually, if you're a nonprofit organization, be a way of like getting volunteers, into like city hall, right? And so if again, like with the sort of setup, if I started with the presumption that I was looking at Publix or something, like it just, that would lead to a very different type of book. So anyways, I'm rambling, but that's kind of, what infrastructural organizing is to me, and what it does sort of empirically and philosophically that other kind of terms don't quite capture.
Perfect. And so just tell us a bit about Code for America. I mean, tell us about the organization, where it came from. We can talk
Sure.
about its kind of ideological background. Just kind of lay it on us, a first Code for America take.
Sure, Code for America. Hey, it's in the name. So they started out really. It's founded by someone named Jennifer Palka. She actually just published her own book like a year ago, and she came out of working in games. So she did a lot of like game events, and also working with Tim O'Reilly. Really,
Okay. Yeah.
really, Tim O'Reilly
Yeah.
and Jennifer Palka are like the intertwined DNA of Code for America.
Hmm.
And it's oftentimes impossible to distinguish between the two of them. They're actually married now, so like,
Well, there you go.
yeah.
Okay.
So no, there's a reason, that it's difficult to distinguish. And
Yeah.
so, but one thing is for sure is that, Jennifer Palka, I credit her with this idea of, bringing geeks. Early on, it was like, we're going to get geeks into City Hall to do technological work. And she sent out, an email that was just titled, I think, I'm Going Rogue. And so it was after like, a decade of working in the games industry. She was going to spin off her own kind of nonprofit, and this was her idea. She herself was very politically active too. She like, you know, was out there marching. But in the early days, it was very much like this digital universalism idea, like, Anita Sechan's notion, right? Um, and there was also this idea, and it was also driven, by the way, by a lot of surplus workers. This is like 2009. You just had like, if not a big, bust, then like a mini bust. And so a lot of people were just out of work, and they were looking for meaning in their lives. And the early, effort was just called the fellowships, and this is still to this day what most people think of when they think of Code for America, because they got so much publicity for it. And the idea was that you would collaborate with local government. You would sort of set up a project, right? They were usually set up ahead of time. Sometimes they phrased it like, we're partnering with governments and we don't know what we'll find. No, they usually had a project plan in place, right? And it was paid for through a combination of local government money, Code for America, sometimes like a third party sponsor. So like in Long Beach, the Molina Foundation kicked in some money because they were working on healthcare stuff. So again, this is like public-private partnership world, like that sort of weird world. And the idea early on was that they would, and this is like, remember Web 2.0? I feel so old. I feel like I just aged like saying that. Like
Nice.
it was like Web 2.0 days, and
Yeah.
they used a lot of web metaphors, a lot of like Mark Zuckerberg is in their very first pitch video in like 2009. Like they were like deeply steeped in the tech world. Google, they got like Google money. And a lot of what they were doing was just trying to, well, one, just like get money anywhere they can. They didn't really, as far as I can tell, they didn't have like an actual organizational strategy. So again, back to what is infrastructural organizing? It really is like using infrastructure as a strategy almost, right? Like there's not like, as far as I know, there's not like a very detailed plan for like the next 10 years of Code for America. Like, maybe there is now that Amanda Renfria is leading the ship, but back then there certainly was just a lot of throwing spaghetti against the wall. And so, these nerds would go into local government. They would kind of live in that city for 9 months or so while they were sort of being shuttled back and forth, from San Francisco to talk with like thought leaders in mainly from the tech industry at that time. Um, and they produced a lot of different technologies that, for the most part, crashed and burned and never got used. And so, a lot of the reasons why the fellowships crashed and burned will come as absolutely no surprise to any listener. So, Chicago's, they were involved in like Chicago's 311 effort, and 311 is like, this Bloombergian idea, right, that you can call into a centralized number. They were originally supposed to create the platform for that, but I'm going to give the brief reasons why they crashed and burned. If you want like the full details,
Read the book.
buy my damn book. Come on.
Right.
But when they got there, so they were the fellows were told that they would be building the platform. When they got there, that didn't happen because a large corporation had already kind of done a contract with Chicago to produce that. And so the city was like, well, you can build something on top of that. And they were like, that doesn't exist yet. And the city was like, well, we have this big contract. And so, like Code for America, just to be clear, like as much as we're talking about the tech industry, like, they can't compete with like the public sector efforts of like Hewlett Packard or something,
Right.
like they
IBM.
just get
Yeah.
crushed like a
Yeah.
bug. And so like, they never had a platform to develop on. And so they did a lot of like listening sessions. And then a lot of the time they had a yearly summit, and there'd be a lot of like smoke and mirrors about, projects. And so it was a lot about the showmanship of it, right? If you trace the actual technologies themselves in local government, I mean, again, I haven't done a complete census of like every Code for America technology, but the ones that I found really did not take off. Another example would be like, they ran afoul of like legal issues like HIPAA violations. Another was that they presumed that, like Tim O'Reilly has sort of with Gov 2.0, which is like his thing.
Oh,
After Web
nice.
2.0, it's like, all right, what do we do with Web 2.0, Gov 2.0? Next thing, very different, very different.
Mhm.
But he describes government as like a convener and enabler, and
Right.
and like,
Platform, right? I mean, there's all
yeah,
these
like,
metaphors like this. Yeah.
yeah, but like people in government, it's a whole different culture. They have strong
Yeah.
opinions and feelings
Right.
about
Right.
the way the way things should go. And so, um,
Yeah.
and then there's just the locality thing. So like, in Long Beach, there was something called Address IQ, and it was developed really to identify habitual overusers of 911 services, because if you think about, 911 services actually, they have to go. Like if you call and you're like, I've been stabbed, they're not going to be like, no, I'm going to ignore you.
Yeah.
So there are some people who are habitual overusers of 911. So the goal of Address IQ would be to identify those people for, the actual ambulance drivers and cops and stuff who are going out there. Um, the, the problem was though, like they already knew who those people were. It's like we're going there every damn day. Um, and it was really more like a managerial thing where like, our mayor could, a guy named Robert Garcia who, is now active, in Congress and is actually doing some really good stuff. But he's also like, he's very like business and tech friendly. So he does a ton of this stuff. So this isn't like a critique of him necessarily, but it just didn't work because the problem on the ground looked different from the problem to a manager. It looked different from the problem to the actual person who probably needs, support other than, an ambulance, right? Like long-term psychological counseling, probably going through some trauma. Like there's a lot of reasons why people call 911 habitually, right? So a lot of these things just meant that a lot of those technologies never got adopted in the way that Code for America imagined, right? In Code for America, the one technology that kept on coming up over and over again is something called Adopt a Hydrant. And Adopt a Hydrant is like very much this like Clay Shirkian idea of like networked volunteerism smushed together with the idea of like you can map stuff on your mobile phone. And the idea was really that in cities where there's a lot of snow, you could adopt a hydrant and shovel it out. So again, emergency responders could kind of get to it. And the idea was you could put it on GitHub. Other governments could find it and pick it up. Like, and there's some stories about this, like Hawaii picked it up as a way to monitor whether um, uh, sirens for tsunamis were working, right? So that there's some examples of it getting picked up, but for the most part, these technologies that were produced by fellows just kind of crashed and burned, never got picked up, and that's just really a problem with a lot of the assumptions about like what very technical people in government situations can accomplish with zero political capital, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah. So that's sort
Yeah.
of like what they first became known for, but even though a lot of that stuff crashed and burned, they got people out in the public eye. Like, there are tons of news stories, and
Yeah.
there are, like, these benevolent nerds in, like, track jackets. Jennifer Palka would, like, send track jackets to fellows. And they look cool. Like, when was the last time you saw, like, a local government employee being, like, looking cool and getting a lot of coverage? Like, that stuff matters to, like, mayors, and it matters to, employees, in government. So, um, even though a lot of that stuff didn't work, um, the fellows didn't cost that much, to the local government. I mean, they'd be like 100K or something. I mean, to a city like Chicago or Philadelphia or Los Angeles, that's like chump change, right?
Yeah.
So, for the good publicity that came out of it, even if the technologies didn't actually work, and it spread. So the fellowship spread the message of the organization, and the image of these people as agentic administrators, and then also kind of set the stage for like a kind of organizational prototype, as I think, um, Daniel Christ puts it, right? For what comes next, right? Where kind of people become technological. So like Code for America realized they couldn't broker in technologies per se, but they could broker in people, right? And that had value too for entirely different reasons. So I'll stop there.
No. So I like your chapter 3. I mean, you do a really good job of describing kind of like it was the vibe around like civic hackers and hackathons. I remember that hackathon moment where they're everywhere suddenly. Um, and I didn't realize it until I was reading your book that like I got triggered by the word open data. I was just like, I had like this extreme, I had this like emotionally charged reaction because I remember that moment where it was like going to be like some people were casting it as like a real solution. And I'm not saying it's not in some cases, but like there was that moment of like kind of overpromise, which always happens with technologies and such, right? But the Code for America ends up landing for a while in this model of the brigades. So can you tell us a bit about like what the brigades were and why this became like the model for a while?
Yeah, and thank you for skipping over chapter 3. Again, I don't think it's the most interesting chapter. I think, other people,
Well,
Lily
it's got to be there, I think.
it's
I
gotta be
think,
there, right?
yeah,
But I don't think it does very much that like Lily Irani hasn't already written on
I got you.
hackathons, right? So,
Yeah.
tip of my hat to her and others who have written in this area. But yeah, the brigades is more interesting. The brigades are interesting because they are their most democratic effort, if I can just sort of normatively say that. That's because they are autonomously run. Um, and they really came from the idea that so when they did the fellowships, they had a ton more applications. They had like 300 over 350 applications more than they had spots. And so, they're like, oh man, like, we have all these people, like, what do we do with them? This is very much like, they're like, we have to do something with them because if we can show sort of the name of the game was if we can show that there are a lot of people out there doing things with technology, then we can unlock more money from Reid Hoffman or Google or
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, they were still sort of operating mostly in tech industry circles. That's where most of their money was coming from at the time. Later on, it was like Knight Foundation. They eventually got this thing that was just called what is the Audacious Foundation grant. It was like $100 million. That was like 2 years ago now. So that was like a big watershed moment. But like back then, they were just like scrambling for cash, right? And so Palka kind of tapped this guy named Kevin Curry, who did a lot of work with City Camp, really looking for a way to put that surplus of fellowship volunteers to use. And a guy named Abi Namani was also in the mix a lot too back then. Um, and Kevin Curry is a little bit more of like I don't know, like an on the ground organizing kind of person. Like Abi's a little bit more wonky and energetic. But they put together this grant for Google basically to get some Google money, and they really based that grant on a bunch of like technological prototypes. So like again, put your brain to sleep, and we're gonna go back, to I guess this is around 2012, I think. And the idea was like, you remember I mentioned like the adopt a hydrant thing, right? Like, okay, so the idea was like, maybe we can put that code on GitHub and anyone in a local community can download it and use it in their community. And this sort of presumes like that number one, like anyone outside of very narrow niche circles knows what the hell GitHub is and has time to do this and thinks it's a good idea. Like there's a lot of assumptions baked into that, but that was sort of like the understanding. There were a few initial efforts. One was called Race for Reuse, um, which was really trying to use these code-based platforms to organize, diffuse publics in different cities. Um, I don't think that was like wildly successful. And in fact, like most people I brought this up to, have been like, oh man, I haven't thought about that in years. Like, man, they're like, they had to think for a moment. But eventually, they, Abi Namani, Kevin Curry, and Jennifer Palka, I think, came together and got some grant money from Google. And what came out of it was this thing called the Brigades. And Kevin Curry has written about it as like for fans of Code for America, And so again, like coming from the Henry Jenkins school, I'm like, oh, fans, right? Like, yeah, like I understand what that means and why they sort of reached for that. And I think sort of coincidentally, it piggybacked on the kind of meetup scene,
Right. Yeah.
in like the early 2010s, and a lot of groups that were like organizing, but they kind of hit a wall when they tried to get too big, right? So if you're like a meetup group, you kind of don't want to actually worry too much about like a lot of the organizing part of it. And so they basically could instead, and again, some of the brigade groups came out of the meetup groups, some didn't, some were like new. Um, but they still could like live under the, nonprofit umbrella, 801c3 umbrella of Code for America. And they just had to kind of sign an agreement that was basically like sometimes they got money early on. I think it was like 5 grand or something. Later on, they didn't. But they would get, like tools, access to tools. I mean, this is very like a Stewart Brand kind of thing. Access to tools,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, you could go, full on and bring this back to like, the Whole Earth catalog. Um, but it was very lightweight and was, kind of rode on existing trends. And it kind of took off on its own. And the story is that Code for America didn't know what the hell to do with actual democratic engagement, because like all of the different groups had different ideas about what it was they were doing. And essentially, they never reconciled what they were doing together. I think my impression is Palka's never explicitly said this, but I think she really believed in the brigades. And I think they had a lot of opportunities to kill them off before they eventually died, which is after Amanda Brantria came in. They had a lot of opportunities to kill them off, but I think they kept them on. And there were a lot of them. I think the numbers are somewhat ginned up, but whatever.
Hmm.
At one point, there were like 90 of them. Um,
Okay.
and again, not all of them, I think, were like healthy or active, but they were at
Sure.
least like, we've signed the agreement, right? And they really consciously used, just the kind of, again, here's an interesting connection, like the Marshall Gantz, Obama, Snowflake model of organizing, right? Similar to, Dave Karp's, hub and spokes kind of idea. And it really was to help these local groups scale. And you really needed like, hub and spokes is like, you need one like kind of leader that you then kind of structure a lot of, network connections around. And so the brigades like did a lot of stuff, you mentioned civic hackathons, a lot of like that kind of stuff, just like on an ongoing basis. So like we're going to meet every month, every third Wednesday, come and get pizza and, we'll figure out how to, work on this app or, still very like oriented towards the technology. Um, it was useful to Code for America because it gave them a near bottomless supply of basically demonstrations of infrastructural citizenship. Because they could point to them and be like, "Look, there are tons of volunteers." And to a degree, I think at one point they claimed like 70,000 people in brigades or something. Again, I don't know. I mean, that's like maybe counting everyone who ever showed up to every event because they were sort of, Code for America was somewhat obsessed with statistics, because nerds, right? Like that's
Yeah.
their ethos.
Well, it's the coin of the nonprofit realm too. You always have to have these numbers to sell to funders.
Right, and that was like a big issue for everyone because they always felt like they were pivoting to like please funders. So it'd
Yeah.
be like Jen Palka would wake up and have a conversation with a funder, and then suddenly they stop what you're doing. You gotta, do this because this is what this funder wants, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes they got grant money, they got some night money,
Sure.
but often it was a loss leader. Like it wasn't really return. It didn't have a good ROI. I'll put it that way.
Right. Right. Right.
Which
Right.
is like not shocking because democracy doesn't really have a good ROI either. Like it just
Preach.
doesn't.
No.
Yeah, it's
No,
like
it doesn't.
but they got a lot of great media, they got ideas, so there are like, so the media would, and this is again a bone of contention, like sometimes brigades would do things that would end up in like Jennifer Palka's pitch deck to, a big foundation, and they'd be like, "You didn't have shit to do with that." Excuse my French, but But it was useful to Code for America in that way. And then also, as there's someone named Jill Byers, I think, Bjers. I'm sorry, Jill, I totally forget how to pronounce your name. And she was in Open Charlotte. And we got to be kind of chummy. Over the pandemic, we hung out a bit um, what's the game? I'm totally blanking. Um, Animal Crossing. So we hung
Oh,
out at
beautiful.
Animal Crossing.
Nice.
So we kind of spent some time together. But she put
Yeah.
it this way, which I think is good. She told me, Code for America themselves can only show large impact, but they can't show small impact. And brigades can tell a story of both scales.
Yeah. Right.
And that I think was really insightful. Another thing that someone told me is without the brigades, Code for America would be Code for San Francisco. Because they would, because early on they didn't have nationwide scope,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
But the
Realistically,
brigades
yeah.
could be like, oh, we're not just in, major cities,
Mhm.
we're in these little towns of 10,000 people.
Yeah.
And so the brigades crashed and burned, and it breaks my heart. And anyone who's listening who's done brigade stuff, it really stinks. Basically, there were a lot of things going on that weren't working in brigade's favor. The first of which is that, again, infrastructural organizing, not big on strategy. Code for America turned over the strategy essentially to the brigades themselves. And they basically kind of said, we like you, but figure out what you're doing together and how to organize and what you're organizing around. And so that is actually was, and so it became a little bit, uh, it was tough. It was tough for the brigade members, to come together. And there were a couple one was called the revisioning project, I think. But they kind of tried to pitch and be to Code for America, be like, this is why you need to keep us, right? And it never really took. One big clash was between community and government frames for organizing, right? So Code for America has always been about we're going to make people the government somehow.
Right.
And a lot of people, again, I write about this a lot in the book, are really more explicitly organizing around racial equity in the local community, and we don't really want to do stuff with the government. And
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
bridge is really hard. If you've ever worked with a community organization, that bridge is really difficult to bridge. Sometimes they brigades would just be interested in oh, we're doing workforce development. We're mentoring people in brigades who would then work in local government. Again, nothing really wrong with that, but weirdly, Code for America never made that play. I mean, that's a common play that you
Oh,
see,
totally.
the
Right.
professionalization route.
Yeah.
But Code for America wasn't really about that. And so there were these big gaps between what the brigades wanted and what Code for America wanted. The brigades were even in a lower position of power than the fellows, because they were just knocking on the doors of City Hall being hey, we're a Code for America brigade. And as the fellowships went on, local government would open those doors, right? But they still couldn't be hey, you need to do X, right? Open data was one of those moments where they could be we're gonna do an open data policy for your city. Open Oakland did this with in Oakland, sort of the classic example. And government was sure, knock yourselves out. It's value added for them. It doesn't, it's not threatening them generally. The other thing that happened was, as might not be a shock to you, when you turn over small local groups to who are, people who are essentially mostly white men, they can essentially camp on the naming rights and do whatever they want. And so you did have, I think, a lot of big personalities kind of squatting. And there's sort of some infamous clashes that came up. Yeah. So one of the examples of like a clash between what I would call the old guard, like, Web 2.0 nerds and local activists, was in Open Oakland. There was this technology that one member developed called Oak Crime, which an application that generated a heat map for crime data that was provided by the Oakland PD. And I think justifiably, some members joined Open Oakland and was like, "What the hell are you doing? You're
Right.
creating."
I remember when this stuff was going down, and yeah, this happened in a couple different cities. I remember these controversies.
Yeah, and so it's one of these examples of a technology that kind of sounds good until you think about it for like more
Right.
than a second. And there was a lot of, clash about that. It got kind of basically, I think it's still on GitHub with a very weird warning on it. Um, but those sorts of clashes, were kind of common. And that's an example of like how despite Code for America, you remember I was like, oh, half of the people in the room put their hands up when I asked who's an activist.
Right.
That can work in like some big tent settings, but when it gets down to brass tacks and you're
Yes.
like, here's the technology I'm working on, people are justifiably going to be like, I'm not, targeting or vilifying, my friends, family, and community, right?
Right.
And so that's the kind of stuff that Code for America didn't kind of, have in mind when they put together the brigades, because they were just thinking about like, how do we get someone to use this code on GitHub? And then
Right.
suddenly they're like, oh, there's local organizations now that we have to think about, and they all have different ideas about what they're going to do.
Yeah. Well, that's
So
democracy too. I mean, that's the
yeah,
thing,
sure.
right?
No doubt. No
Yeah.
doubt. Democracy is messy and it has friction, and infrastructural organizing oftentimes tends to privilege the frictionless ones, right? And so just to close the loop on this real quick, yeah, the brigades essentially got decommissioned by Amanda Rentria when she came on, who's the new, CEO slash, leader of Code for America. And who's someone, by the way, with much more political savvy and capital than Jen Palka, in my opinion. And she kind of comes from more of a DC background. Um, but I think and this was right after they got $100 million grant, but even that couldn't kind of save the brigades, just because, again, the ROI thing. Like, I've talked with people who are like literally in the meeting where, the brigades were killed, and it pretty much came down to cost benefit analysis. Like,
Yeah.
we can't justify putting money towards these things, even though that money was not a huge amount of money in the grand scheme of things. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a sad story, but also I think a cautionary tale for any nonprofit trying to organize in this space. Like, these are all things that could happen to you.
Right. You kind of this discussion about the disagreements about kind of different activist visions, that kind of nicely sets up where I wanted to go. I mean, earlier you talked about when you have a book on your hands, and part of it's about evolution, right? And I think at the later parts of your book, there's two important evolutions going on, and I just wanted to give you a chance to kind of talk through each of them. Just give us a tidbit, just so that talk readers into or listeners into buying the book. But one is the techlash happens. You have this nice phrase, post-techlash politics. So there's this kind of like this vision of justice comes in, and design, a real design focus. I thought that was fascinating, given my kind of interest in stuff I've written back in the day. And then the other thing that happens is what you call the narrow play. And I think the last body chapter is titled Selling Administration, which is like a fascinating evolution. So tell us a bit about that. Tell us a bit about the post-techlash politics and justice, and then the narrow play and how the organization kind of evolved.
Sure. So I think the post-techlash politics chapter 5, it's really about what I just call intersectional designers and how they operate as what I call empathy brokers, right? So it's not that they come in with technology that solves people's problems, but in the design process, they demonstrate that they care, and for a lot of service design, that actually matters. And I put that chapter before the narrow play just because the design stuff, leads up to the narrow play in a lot of ways. Even though honestly, one of the big challenges was like, as I mentioned, like at the start, like all this stuff was happening at once, like
Right, right, right,
2015, 2016, 2017, right?
right.
But yeah, I think the chapter 5, about the intersectional designers, this is really a story about and to be entirely frank, like someone should rewrite this chapter almost because it's the most, I think, it's good and it's fine, but it's also the weakest empirically because I just don't have that many interviews. And I didn't get that much material. That said, I thought it was very important to have a chapter that was like explicitly addressing intersectionality questions of race, class, gender, and so on. As interpreted by the people who are doing infrastructural work. Like I think
Right.
that was like super duper important.
Yep.
That said, someone else could write this
Well, it
better.
could be a whole other book. I mean, it was a whole
Sure, no
entire
doubt.
movement, right?
Yeah,
But yeah, but I agree. You have to have a chapter on this too, because it's an important part of
yeah,
what was going on.
yeah. And so that chapter really tells the story of user-centered design as it was introduced by someone named Sid Harrell, who,
Who, by the
um,
way, I'm interacted with on Twitter, or at least seen stuff with on Twitter, but I didn't know the context, so it was very helpful for me
yeah, and
to learn that
so
background.
yeah, and so she now, works for the city of San Francisco. I'm sorry, Sid, I forget your exact title right now. People's titles change a lot. Um, but she's sort of at the CTO level for the city of San Francisco. But yeah, she and again Jen Palka were talking, and this whole book is really like Jen Palka and her network. But it's like Jen Palka was talking with someone. That's like where most of these things come from. And basically, she wanted someone to teach user-centered design to fellows. This is like 2012, 2013, early on. Um, and, user-centered design ended up being, it ended up opening a lot of doors for Code for America for a number of reasons. I mentioned the kind of brokering and empathy thing. I think that's important, right? Like, you could get Hewlett Packard to do this, but, we're gonna work on niche causes that really affect, people essentially like us, the designers, right? And so you had designers coming in, um, who are using these design methods, to improve government services. And so you sort of see this progression, if they started out with like digital universalism, user-centered design, and then to, a lot of design practices that were centering things like racial equity, and along with a lot of, I'm just sort of rolling my head back, a lot of other terms like trauma-informed
Oh
design
yeah.
and probably a lot of terms I've like lost track of. But this new guard, I think there's sort of like two stories you could tell. One is that they, by being employees, they could advocate for, a more ardent sense of equity and inclusion, like internally. I think that's true, but I also think, like what we're pushing for actually got legitimated, as like a fundable organizational strategy, like starting maybe, I don't know, in the late 2010s, right? And it also opened the door to projects that ended up being massively influential, like Clear My Record, which started out as sort of a pet project of someone named Fury, and then ended up, becoming like a mothership project. But the whole idea was that they were going to locate um, people who are eligible for expunging criminal records for minor like marijuana offenses now that, that ended up being legal in states like California. So again, like pretty niche effort. But a lot of the design tools were like, again, produced a lot of good media. We're going to go collect stories and personas, and there's even like videos of like, we're going to bring out the people who are impacted by government food assistance on stage, right? And here are the people we can help, and they're going to tell their story. Another project, it's like Clear My Record, and then another one is famous one is just called Get Cal Fresh, which is built on essentially SNAP benefits in California, so government food assistance, and basically, again, locating people who were eligible for that assistance, but maybe didn't realize it, right? And again, it's sort of a long story, but design ended up being offering the tools to Code for America that they could then kind of use to gather all that semiotic material, and then also, again, this is sort of the bridge, to
The narrow
the
play.
narrow play,
Yeah.
is they could get no bid contracts, right? So if you're a Hewlett Packard, and this is something I didn't realize before I started all this, right? Like if you're a Hewlett Packard and you're producing a technology, you go through a whole, process where you are, writing out that proposal, being vetted. I mean, it's really long and it's actually not open to a lot of smaller players just because
Yeah.
it's like you have to have dedicated grant writers, right?
Right.
And people applying to these things. But if you're doing something like improving recruitment, that's actually more of like a human thing, right? That's
Uh-huh.
actually something that you don't have to go through that whole selection process for.
Yeah.
And that opened up a ton of opportunities because, the big kind of public sector tech players, they're going after like $100 million, $200 million
Yes.
contracts. Code for America did not need that.
Right. Right. Right.
They were happy as a clam with a couple $1 million. Even if a lot of that was, put plugged into things like targeted Facebook ads and
Right.
and then also a lot of the design work. So that's sort of like, I think that's why I put that chapter before the narrow play, because I do think that's where you can sort of understand where the narrow play came from.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of fascinating. You have it just to like, it's always when I'm talking to authors that I start to see the sweep and structure of the book better than I did when I was reading it on my own. But now I kind of see it as a story of this kind of very early on, very idealistic, universalist kind of organization born of kind of Silicon Valley ideologies. We didn't even get into that, but I mean, very wrapped up in that. And by the end, you've got something that's like, I don't know, a nonprofit public sector services operation, right?
Yeah, like what is it? And I think that's the reason why I didn't want to rewrite the Californian ideology
Right.
again or something, right?
Yeah.
Because that's a story that's been told, and we all get the Silicon Valley ideology thing.
Yeah.
Even
Yeah.
like I get that that's sort of like the background. But yeah, the narrow play ended up. I think there's also an interesting story of the narrow play as not being set in stone from the beginning, right? This was
Yes.
actually something that was subjected to fairly contentious debates inside Code for America. Um, and on one hand, you had people who were very much subscribed to, the model of, the UK's Government Digital Services, or GDS, right? And Jennifer Palka and Tim O'Reilly visited GDS. And so, again, this is like where they get a lot of the service design language. Built on Michael Barber's notion of deliverology, right? So you're going
Hmm.
to deliver services, this like e-government thing where like,
Yeah.
we're going to deliver improved services and thereby change people's opinions about government as a whole,
Yes.
right? And they tried to import essentially a GDS model into Code for America, and it kind of didn't take. And it didn't take because there was actually a lot of pushback internally among people who were of the mindset, they just called themselves the Do team. And they were just like a group of people who are like, we actually want to, make people's lives better tangibly, in immediate ways. Like, we don't want to build a platform. So like there was an initial effort, that was like for a GDS style play that was just called Chime. And Chime was like, again, like the front door, like door chime. And they would make your government's website. Um,
Right.
right? So like that was like more or less the whole pitch. But then think about like all the stuff you could build off of it, right? It was like,
Yeah,
again,
sure.
government as a platform,
Yeah.
that kind of idea. And then there was another team that was, again, the Do team, which included people, on the Get Cal Fresh project, that really advocated for pursuing particular focus areas. Essentially thematically similar verticals that directly improved residents' lives. So again, back to like government food assistance, like, yeah, a lot of them are basically like, yeah, we're doing this very neoliberal thing, but at the end of the day, like maybe someone's getting fed who
Well,
wouldn't
to get them
otherwise get
public
fed.
benefits that are
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a longer story, but like the intermediaries who actually handle that stuff, there's little incentive for them to improve recruitment.
Yeah.
And so
Right,
there
right.
was like, I think this is a story that like I haven't seen told anywhere, which is like
Yeah.
the idea that digitizing government services is not going to be one thing. It's not just, and I'm pretty clear about this. It's not just like Silicon Valley setting up shop in, in City Hall. It's something different. And I think we're lacking the language for it. I call it the narrow play, just because, they could do stuff, in the city, at the local and state level, in like San Francisco and California, that then they could scale up to do, at the federal level. So like, oh, we were doing, government food assistance at the state and local level, but, maybe we could do something at the federal level for like veteran benefits, right? Um, so that was why, in my opinion, the narrow play took off because, they could get money to do this stuff. It gave them incentive to pursue these, again, thematically similar, focus areas. And yeah, some of the employees were fairly, blunt with me. I mean, one of them put it, and this is like a subheading in my book: "You come for system change and stay for client impact."
Right, 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 right.
Like some of them were like a
Yeah.
little jaded, but you know what? Like, again, this is part of the equation that, again, I don't see talked about very much, which is like there's a lot of shaping of technological practices and political action by the constraints imposed by a political system. And so, like you can't do a GDS style play where you're creating websites for government for a number of reasons, not the least of which is it doesn't really differentiate you because there's like, I don't know, 1,000 different companies doing
Yeah.
that. But the other one is that like the US political system, the federated system is not like, the UK. Like it's not
Yeah.
as
It's
top down.
not.
And there's
Yeah.
pros and
Yeah.
cons to that, right?
Right.
And so, there's someone who in his Twitter bio used to have it's something like flourishing in the cracks of federalism or something like that. And so you do sort of have these opportunities, um, but like you can't just, Silicon Valley, like whatever that means, like you can't just like walk into City Hall and be like, I'm going to transform what you're doing. They have to go through,
Yeah.
some
Right.
established channels, right? And
Right.
so I think that was kind of like the most interesting chapter for me. It was also, in my opinion, to be totally blunt, like totally boring to like my activist friends. They were like, ugh,
Yeah.
they're
Well,
like,
I also see why you see the brigades as a sad story
for
on some
sure.
level too, right? Because at least that was more democratic and participatory than the narrow play, right?
Yeah. So if you're and this is I think one of the big lessons too, like if you're an implementer, you actually don't gain a lot of political power. I'm rephrasing again, I'm sort of washing and rephrasing a lot of classic STS chestnuts, but um yeah, it's I think that's sort of one of the big lessons too.
So tell us what you're up to now these days, and tell us about the Indelible Voice.
Sure.
I want to get that on the tape.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I basically am a professional editor and writing coach now. I did 2 years of a postdoc. I took a whack at the tenure track tree, and no fruit fell out for me. And so life continues, and I'm actually happy as a clam. I've been doing this for like 6 years now. And yeah, a lot of really working on a lot of really cool projects. And it's been an interesting turn for me, just because like I started out as a communication researcher and now I'm a communication practitioner. And so, a lot of the things I sort of noticed in the Code for America sphere, I'm like, oh yeah, like I have to actually, be there for my clients. And my clients are, I'm an academic editor and writing coach. So I'm really working on the inside of a lot of, as will be no surprise, like STS, communication, informatics, books. My biggest client is University of California, Irvine's informatics, department. And yeah, it's honestly a blast. I keep on waiting for, like, the bottom to fall out, but, it's perfect for me as a person just because I don't have to engage with a lot of the somewhat contentious politics at the department and school level, and I can
Yeah.
keep focused on, just doing what I love, which is working with words and really working with grad students.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the things we've talked about before in other conversations is how much, not that you are a licensed therapist. That's not what I'm saying. But that, there's so much work when writing, there's so much caught up in writing, right? And so often you're working with folks who are working through their shit and that's caught up with the writing. So there's this very interesting kind of therapeutic interpersonal dimension to your work too that I think is cool. Is that fair?
Totally fair. Sometimes I just describe myself as like a writing therapist
Yeah.
because so much of the baggage and every academic,
Yeah.
author listening to this is probably nodding their head. There's so much baggage that comes with writing. Nobody thinks they do it well.
Yeah.
Even like, full professors, I've been like working with people who are like full professors and they're like, can I tell you something privately? And I'm like, sure. And it's all confidential, right?
Yeah. Sure.
Sometimes I use examples like in my writing, but they're extremely anonymized and
Yeah.
also like not associated with like political tensions in institutions or anything that people care about.
Yeah.
It's more like writing problems. But, I've had like full professors talk to me and be like, can I confide to you? Like, I don't think I'm that good a writer. And I'm like, well, you've written 6 books,
Yeah.
so I'm pretty sure you're okay. It's like,
Yeah.
it's one of these things that ends up being just so fraught and also something that a lot of PhD students, for a variety of reasons, just don't have the resources for, don't, or have never actually been educated in any
Right. I
formal
totally
way.
agree with that.
And
Yeah.
so like,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, this has been my niche is like, working with grad students, working with professors, and in some cases, like Irvine being hired, for like many years to work one-on-one with grad students, which ends up working out well. And I can also specialize a bit in the sort of interdisciplinary technology studies stuff. Although I've broadened my practice, like I work on history books, I've worked on like, long histories of like the Holocaust and anthropology books, sociology books. And, I mentioned earlier, like I was not a very good PhD student because I was pulling myself in too many different directions. Well, guess what? That's awesome for an editor and writing coach because I get to work on new stuff every day.
Yes, I hear you.
And that's just fun as hell to me.
Yeah.
And I get
That's
to
awesome.
make a difference. So that's actually my next book is going to be on this.
That's awesome. I'm
and
looking forward to
then-
that. Yeah.
Yeah, and thanks so much for asking. Eventually, maybe I'll come back to like the organizing stuff. But right now, my head's sort of in the writing space.
Amen, man. Well, my buddy R, thank you so much for coming on today. I knew it would be a blast, and it really was. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me, and it was a pleasure to chat with you today. And yeah, I'm just thrilled in all the things that you managed to coax out of me, and there's a lot of synergy with other topics you talked about on your podcast.
Totally. And episodes actually that aren't even out yet, I could talk about. So it's great. It's going to fit with a bunch of cool things.
We'll wait until I listen to them. No spoilers. No spoilers.
Yeah, I will say, we can end with this. I will say that your book and Ben Shestakovsky's book, Beyond the Startup, I think it's called, something like that, have a lot. Well, they're both about scale. So those would be two great episodes for folks to listen to back to back.
Fantastic. Yeah, well, thanks so much.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at STS_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.